The history of pigments used in watercolour isn't just about how we got to paint pretty pictures. It's a history of trade, of psychology, of our evolution, our understanding of chemistry, of human rights, and even of politics. The colours that we have had access to throughout our history have defined who we are and how others see us. The earth pigments that we used in prehistoric times are still being used today. The interest and durability in other colours lasting little more than a generation. Georgian and Victorian toxic colours have been banned. In others, toxicity has yet to be recognised, while pigments such as cadmium are being reassessed owing to new understanding of ecological sensitivities. By the pre-Raphaelite artist Henry Wallace, painted in 1856. It shows the suicide by arsenic poisoning of the poet Thomas Chatterton. Chatterton died at the age of 17, and this image, painted almost 90 years after his death, sealed his fame as the archetypal neglected genius of romantic poetry. He became more famous for his suicide than for anything he ever wrote. The picture had a huge impact wherever it was exhibited, and when it was reproduced in print form, proved to be one of the most popular Victorian paintings. They certainly responded to the idea of the melancholic poet suffering for his art. By the way, just to burst that little bubble, new evidence does suggest that the opium-addicted Chatterton was taking arsenic as a cure for a sexually transmitted disease and may simply have confused the dosage, resulting in his tragic death. People at the time were very aware of the danger of large doses of arsenic taken by mouth. It seems that the problem was their very casual attitude to the insidious danger that arsenic posed in its use as a colorant. It was used in wax candles, wallpaper, artificial flowers, cosmetics, gloves, food, confectionery, particularly cake decorations, medicine, textile dyes, and ground down more finely for the inclusion in oil and watercolour paints and inks. The reason for the acceptance on this level in so many aspects of their lives was the beautiful green colour and a thirst for the newly available products in this burgeoning economy. There was a need for a green that was bright, cheap, light fast and durable, unlike the copper carbonate derived green pigments of the time such as malachite and verdigris. Discovered in 1775 by the Swedish chemist Carl Scheele, Scheele's green is copper arsenate. There's obviously a clue there in the name, and at the time Scheele was aware that there could be a problem with toxicity. For a number of reasons, he hadn't benefited from his other professional discoveries, so where his new pigment was concerned, he was of the opinion that the benefits outweighed the negatives and chose not to alert people to the detrimental effects. Within a few years, Scheele's green had become hugely popular. Scheele's green was Napoleon's favourite colour, and it was used in his residence in St Helena, the island on which he was exiled. In a climate of high humidity, the use of arsenic in interior decoration would result in arsenic vapour being released into the room. We know that Napoleon died of stomach cancer, but the arsenic poisoning would certainly have contributed to his death, and indeed arsenic was found when samples of his hair were analysed. Also, records show that Napoleon liked to take long, leisurely, steamy baths. Certainly not a good idea if your home is adorned with toxic wallpaper. 40 years after Scheele's green was discovered, a patent was granted to William Sandler. He produced a replacement for Scheele's green, which became known as Paris or emerald green. As a colorant, it was more stable and opaque, but still formulated with arsenic and still deadly poisonous. This bright green green was adored as a colour for fashionable dresses of the day. Often fixed to ball gowns with albumen or dextrin, the poisonous dust would brush free from the garment when the ladies were dancing. A ball gown made up of 20 metres of fabric could distribute 60 grains of arsenic in a single evening. The lethal dose was 5. This cartoon of the day suggested that wearing green for the sake of fashion was literally dancing with death. By the late 19th century, there was growing concern over the use of arsenic in household products, and it was banned in a number of countries. 21 people died and hundreds were taken ill in Bradford when a sweetmaker, who came to be known as Humbug Billy, mistakenly made sweets using 2 pounds of arsenic in the recipe instead of the plaster of Paris he had intended to use as a filler. Elsewhere, the fashion for ornately decorated puddings resulted in deaths from eating green Blemonge. The wallpaper patterns of the artist and interior designer William Morris were hugely popular. The wonderful foliage designs evoked a commitment to a natural aesthetic after years of industrialization. For these designs, an arsenic-based pigment was perfect. It performed well and was cheaper and easier to make. Interestingly, since arsenic was a known pesticide, it was considered sensible to incorporate it into the wallpaper, as it would have the added benefit of keeping down pests in the home. William Morris, who was heir to a huge copper mine, arsenic being a byproduct of copper mining, denied that there was a problem with the wallpaper, as neither he nor friends and family had experienced ill effects. Evidence was growing, however, concerning the danger of poisonous vapour in damp homes and the extreme suffering of those exposed to arsenic in their place of work. In November 1861, there was news of the tragic death of the flower maker Matilda Shera. These artificial flowers, destined to be worn as hair and hat ornaments, were finished with arsenic dust to give them a beautiful green iridescence. Either breathing the dust or having the poison enter the bloodstream through abrasions led to her very painful death, and people were horrified to read of the grisly details. The Arsenic Act of 1868 went some way to addressing people's concerns. Manufacturers became arsenic-free as synthetics became available. William Morris had discontinued arsenic in his wall coverings by 1886. Emerald green was superseded by cobalt green and viridian, but because of its history, green had become symbolic of poison, the colour of villainy, jealousy and witchcraft. To this day, when we think of poison, we think of a green liquid. In the 19th century, the colour green supported the quest of many artists for the new aesthetic language. It's interesting to look at some of the artistic works of the time, knowing that the newly available colours could be so inspirational, but also deadly in their toxicity. This picture of Guildford from the banks of the River Wey was painted by JMW Turner in 1805. From analysis, we know that he used Shearer's green mixed with other colours to give a range of greens throughout the picture. Painted in 1832, this watercolour illustration for a book of poems shows that Turner had switched to using emerald green. You can see this from the very bright bag that the boy has on his back. Again from 1832, we can see Turner using green in this painting of Rouen, but mixing the greens, making them more subtle in expression. This is Turner's field set of watercolours. He put them together himself using the leather binding from an old book. The manufacturers of the day were constantly striving to improve watercolours, but Turner preferred the older type, which were much more difficult to soften, so needed a lot of scrubbing up, and often grew mould on the top. As we've discovered, mould and arsenic paint are not ideal in combination. In 1874, the Impressionists were essentially founded on the principle of plein air painting, that is, painting outside in the moment. The availability of the new green was hugely inspirational and key to the highly spontaneous depiction of the world around them. This is music in the Tuileries by Edouard Manet from 1862. It's been analysed to find that Manet had used both Scheele's green and emerald green, using them in combination in two different glazes. In the one glaze, the greens are mixed with yellow lake, ivory black and yellow ochre. In another, they're mixed with yellow ochre and white to create a more opaque glaze. Claude Monet used emerald green in this picture of the bathers at Grenouillet from 1868 and the Japanese bridge 1899. Monet famously battled with deteriorating eyesight, and it's now known that arsenic poisoning can be a cause of cataracts. On the subject of eyesight, the authoress Jane Austen was virtually blind by the end of her life, possibly as a result of accidental arsenic poisoning, the chemical being a popular treatment for rheumatism. You might not have heard of Frederick Basile, the Impressionist. He died young in the Franco-Prussian War, but I've included him because in this lovely self-portrait, here he is showing us his palette with the greens there at the bottom of the palette, squeezed out, ready to be used. The 1888 picture, The Old Woman at Arles, was painted by Gogh while he was staying with Vincent van Gogh. It was a response to a series of garden pictures that Vincent had created. The two constantly debated painting theory, and Gogh wanted to show the superiority of painting from memory and imagination to painting from life, which was the current symbolist doctrine. The result here is a triumph of anti-naturalism. The large areas of green, instead of giving us a reality, are used to create a claustrophobic and mysterious atmosphere. We know that Van Gogh suffered from a huge number of health problems, the cause of which have been a source of conjecture since his tragic death by suicide at the age of 37. There are a number of theories as to the cause of his problems, but whichever you're inclined to believe, without a doubt, all of them would have been exacerbated by the use of toxic paints. He's known to have licked his brushes and, in his more manic phases, eaten paint. This is a picture of Madame Roulin, also known as La Berceuse, which means lullaby, painted in 1889. In her hand is the string that she's pulling to gently rock the cradle. Van Gogh was extremely intellectually curious, doing copious research into colour theory. You can see from this example, Van Gogh loved his greens, the beautiful bright green in this picture enhanced by the complementary red. Self-Portrait with Damaged Ear was painted in 1889 after he had self-mutilated following an argument with Gogh. Apart from the toxicity of the white lead and the green paint he's used, he's also wearing a rather fetching green coat, the fabric of which may well have been coloured with arsenic dye. Behind him on the wall is an example of the Japanese prints which Vincent collected and was so inspirational to his art. We now know that arsenic sulfides were used extensively in their printing process. Cézanne liked to use his colours straight from the tube rather than mixing them with other colours, using a system which he called modulation, and green seems to be his most frequently used pigment. Many consider that the toxicity of the green in his pictures was responsible for him developing severe diabetes, which is a symptom of chronic arsenic poisoning. During the 20th century, genuine emerald green was withdrawn as a pigment, although not completely discontinued until the 1960s. Scheele's green is just a small part of the fascinating history of colour. In retrospect, the Georgians and Victorians seem so careless with known toxins, but here in the 21st century, perhaps we're being equally cavalier where our health is concerned. It remains to be seen.